So we got as far as moving to University of Toronto and connecting up with David Turner in Toronto. And at that period of time, David was developing. Uh, it was in process developing a lot of the theoretical ideas, which, looking back, of course, are now more or less fully formed. Um, what was going on is he'd started, of course, with his work in Australia. He worked in Groot Eland with the Anandilwagwa in Australia, and he wrote this book, which is called Australian Aboriginal Social Organization, and what it does is it lays out few limited principles upon which Australian Aboriginal Social Organization is based, and then it works out what all the variations are. So it's a highly structuralist exercise, following very, very much from the kind of things that Lévi-Strauss had written about in Elementary Structures of Kinship. I often joke that I'm probably the only person in the English Academy anymore who's actually read at Elementary Structures of Kinship, and I could probably still do a lecture on it if I thought about it, but everybody else claims to have read it, but I'm not sure that they actually have. But it was based on those kind of notions. It was a critique of what Lévi-Strauss says in Elementary Structures of Kinship, but it was also developing that. And so he laid out the notion in Australia that it was founded upon these clearly and discreetly defined landowning groups where they own specific pieces of territory. That those membership in those landowning groups is patrilineal throughout Australia. You have to get into. I know you have to get into some finer work on what they mean by patrilineal. He does that, but I'm not going to follow that. Those patrilineally defined landowning groups have two sets of exchanges. The landowning groups are linked together via what we call song lines, through the mythology, through the stories. They're linked together into sort of chains of landowning groups. And essentially goods flow along those chains. One of the things about the landowning groups in Australia is that no group can be self-sufficient. No group owns enough land that they could actually be self-sufficient. In fact, they usually own a specific resource on the land, and so therefore they have to trade that resource with everybody else. So along the song lines, along the mythological lines, are go economic exchanges, and between the landowning groups you have marriage exchanges, and the classic marriage exchanges. It's still phrased in those days, although I know there's critique since of the clans exchanging women. But those principles that sort of 4 or 5 principles David lays out at the beginning of the book, and then he essentially says that the marriage exchanges can happen every generation. That's a Carriera system. Every alternate generation, that's an Aranda system. Or every third generation, that's a Barty system. And that's kind of the limit, because you can't go for another generation of exchanges and have people remember all the relationships. So basically, those are the 3 core systems. And what he does in the book is lays those out. And then he goes on to talk about what were the anomalous systems, or apparently anomalous systems, in Australia. And what he argues, the Merngen is the famous case. It was written up by a guy called, I think it was called Warner, now I've forgotten. But anyway, Merngen is a classic case. And what David argued in his book was that, in fact, if you are changing from an exchange every generation, a Carriera type system, to an Aranda type system, in the middle of that process of changing, it comes out looking like a Merngen, what they described as a Merngen system. So that's basically the idea. There's more to it than that, but that's the basic idea that we needed here. When I was in 4th year as an undergraduate, we did a seminar on, and I'll probably forget it now, asymmetric patrilateral exchange systems, which, as you probably already are well aware, don't exist. So the question was, I mean, they exist theoretically. Anthropologists can generate this theoretically, but they don't actually exist in practice. And there's a whole argument. There had been a whole argument at the time about why this was the case, and we did what David wanted to do was look at the cases that were in Australia, and try and work out, given the kind of theory that I just gave you, what was why were these things coming up looking like these asymmetrical systems. So we in fact did a course when I was in fourth year, a seminar course where we actually each one of us took one of these systems in Australia and sort of worked through it using the ideas that David had outlined in his theory of theory of Australian social organization, and it was actually really a fun course. A lot of hard work because you had to pull together the theory, and it was at that time the main fight between Needham, which Needham had led, was over, but it still had to work out the case studies, right? So it was a really, really good exercise. It was sort of a very technical exercise in kinship analysis. The funny thing about doing that course is that the next year, when I went on to my graduate program, I was sitting with the graduate director. The graduate director was a guy called Suichi Nagata at the time. And Suichi was going over my courses, what I'd done, and therefore what I would need to do in graduate school. And he looked at this course and he said, and he looked at the title of it and he said, "Who the hell authorized this course?" And I told him who had authorized it. He said, "But there's no such thing." And I said, "Well, I know." And he just burst out laughing, and then we continued on the discussion. That was the kind of very technical work we were doing with David. We were working on some of those issues around kinship and social organization. But what had since happened is David took that theory and he did a kind of mental exercise. So we're still in the heart of structuralism here. Did a mental exercise of what happens if you take all of those principles and invert them. Turn them upside down. What does it look like if you do that? And in that mental exercise, well, he'd actually done this the year before, but when you do that inversion, it comes out looking very, very much like, and the case study that he picked up on was Bill Dunning's book, Social and Economic Change Amongst the Northern Ojibwa. It comes out looking awfully like a Cree and Ojibwa, Cree or Ojibwa kinship system. And that was quite startling, okay? So he had actually had a student from the University of Manitoba, a guy called Paul Wertman, go up to Shamattawa in northern Manitoba to kind of do an initial test on this hypothesis to see if it actually worked. The idea in this case is that whatever your landowning group is, your landowning group has sufficient access or access to sufficient territory to provide for all of its resources, all of its needs internally. And so that, in fact, the relationships among the local social groups are based on sort of co-residence and co-production relationships. It's a co-production kind of model. And in fact, what the relationship system, the kinship system reflects is the history of those co-production relationships over time over a bounded area of land. And so that was the kind of model that he proposed. And as I said, a reading of Bill Dunning's book suggested that that's what was going on with the Ojibwe. And the study that Paul Wertman did, and Paul and David later wrote up in a book on Shamattawa, the study that Paul Wertman did kind of refined and reinforced that notion. I always remember David, when he was working on that book with Paul, the initial title of the book was called The Boys in the Band. Until David realized that it wasn't just the boys in the band, it was actually the boys and the girls in the band. And so he had to sort of change his thinking about that. As he as these notions developed, David came to characterize them under two terms. One was a federative model, so that's the Australian Aboriginal notion, was a federative model, where you have these distinct small landowning groups that, in order to support themselves, have to create federative relationships with each other, both through economic exchanges and through marital exchanges. Then the other model was what he came to call incorporative. And the idea of incorporative was that if you start off with two distinct social bodies of whatever kind, and we can come back to that, that when those two bodies come together, they merge into and form a single social unit. So the distinct unit disappears and they become one. In marriage, and this particularly shows up in marriage relationships, that at least in the Cree context, that when a man and a woman marry, they merge together and they form a new identity, a new social unit. Of course, we're talking about the time in the West when, at those days when you got married, the woman would become incorporated into the man's social identity in the West, but not in the Cree context. They'd form a new social unit. In the Australian Aboriginal context, when a man and a woman got married, they continued to maintain their original clan relationships. They never lost or changed their original clan relationships. They were still there. And so they never merged together into a kind of a single social unit. So that was that was the notion of incorporation that David developed. Now, the problem was, the other thing, by the way, I just have to note, because a lot of people don't remember this anymore. Bill Dunning's book, Social and Economic Change Amongst the Northern Ojibways, is actually quite an interesting book. Bill Dunning had studied under Edmund Leach at Cambridge, and so he had picked up on some of the structural notions of social organization. And in that book, Bill Dunning suggests that the difference between parallel cousins and cross cousins, and he has a whole thing about parallel cousins and cross cousins, that his argument is that the actual effect of that distinction is to create a marriageable cross cousins, marriageable group versus an unmarriageable group. So it's within the context of the band to create that division between a category that allows for marriage, which was, by the way, a very radical notion and one that's not actually picked up on very often in the literature. So that's one of the things that David picked up on in there. So, but the problem is, if you're dealing with these kind of pragmatic co-production, co-residence type systems, and if David was right about those principles, what are the variations? How does it work? And analytically and theoretically, there was no particular way for us to think out what the variations could be, because it's based on pragmatic circumstances. It's based on sort of the history of production circumstances. So what would the variations look like, if there were any? And that's where we were sort of, as I'm going in through fourth year university and coming into graduate school. What are the possible variations on these systems? And really the only way to test it was to test it empirically. So at that time there were about 6 of us. Well, there were a couple of others, but not in. But there were about 6 of us who were studying and working with David. And essentially what David did is lined the 6 of us up and said, okay, you go do West Coast, you go do Dene, you go do Iroquois, you go do Inuit, and that's, of course, the finger pointed at me. You deal with Inuit. And so our job was to sort of test across the various groups across Canada what they were. I can't remember all of the people who were involved in that. I can only tell you that there was Guy Lanoux, who worked with the Secondary, who then went on and taught at Université de Montréal, and there was Bob Adlam, who worked with the Tahltan. He went on and taught still teaches at Mount Allison. but I can't remember who the others were in that group now. Um, and then there was me that did the was to do the Inuit. So on the basis of that kind of designation, I'm sure David would deny that it was that kind of. But these are still in the days when you did what your doctoral supervisor told you to do. The idea that you came up with your own idea in doctoral thesis was fairly limited, right? So we didn't have a whole lot of choice. Um, so what I did in that was my fourth year. Um, Now this is when things get a little complicated. Uh, at U of T, you couldn't actually do an honors degree. They didn't have an honors degree at U of T. However, I was at Trinity College, and Trinity had an option where you could do a thesis in fourth year. It was worth 12 credits, so it was quite a massive piece. And so in my fourth year, I did an honors thesis, which was a survey of Inuit social organization based on the kind of principles we'd been working on. If you want, I don't recommend it, but if you want, you can go and look that up. That's still sitting in the Trinity College Library at the University of Toronto. We had to file our theses with the college library, so it's still there. I would ask that nobody go and look at it, please, because it was very much an undergraduate attempt. But what it was is it kind of picked up on the work that David Damas had been doing. He'd done it slightly earlier, but where he looked at the comparative studies between the Igloolik, the Netsilik, and the Copper, and he did 2 or 3 different kinds of analyses across those 3 where he compared them. It picked up on that. It included the Caribou Inuit. I don't remember what else it included, but anyways, it did a kind of survey and analysis on the basis of the kind of things, the kind of principles that we'd already talked about. So that was basically my entire fourth year. My entire fourth year was spent reading all the literature on Inuit social organization. So that's when I first encountered and read that stuff. So there were a couple of other advantages to studying at University of Toronto, which I didn't just study with David. One was that I actually, Bill Dunning was actually still teaching at the University of Toronto in those days. And I did my first course on Native Canadians. I don't even know what it was called, Native Canadians with Bill Dunning. And I have to confess that for years I used my notes from that course when I had to teach those courses. But he was a fabulous teacher, and it was a real privilege to be able to study with somebody like him. So there are other people there. The other person who I want to mention, who was very important to me, but I don't know that anybody's ever heard of him, and that's a guy called Roger MacDonell. Roger worked with one of the Dene groups in the Yukon. I can't remember which one it was now. Roger was one of those people who just could not fit into the university as an institution, as a system. But he was probably one of the more brilliant anthropologists I've ever encountered. And in fact, he taught me, I can't remember what year I did it in, but he taught a course on anthropology of religion. And so all of the stuff that I came to, the foundations of the stuff that I came to know about in terms of symbolism and religion, came from Roger's teaching. And interestingly enough, that year in that course, he got to talking at one point about the structural study of myth, and he chose as his case example to do in class the Nuliayuk story, the classic Inuit story, and to hear Roger lecture on that story and to open up that story in the way that he did was just a total revelation for me. I had no idea that you could do those kind of readings, and that those readings could be so exciting and so interesting. And so he wrote actually, David Turner and Gavin Smith wrote a book called Challenging Anthropology, or they edited a book called Challenging Anthropology, which was, I can't tell you when it was published, I think 1978. It was kind of a survey of critical anthropology in Canada at the end of the 70s or beginning of the 80s. it's quite amazing who wrote in that book, by the way, who's in that book. It was intended as an undergraduate textbook for undergraduates in anthropology. However, it was way too difficult. The book is a pretty interesting graduate textbook, but it's far too difficult for undergraduates. And Roger did a paper in there. Roger did an article in there on the anthropology of religion, where he talks about various theories and approaches to religion and symbolism, but he was using the word religion. And he uses throughout that text the Inuit as a case study. So again, for me, it was an amazing piece because it opened up that whole thing. And just to give you one little example out of there, he spent some time working on the distinction between animals of the land and animals of the sea, and how this is a fundamental binary distinction in Inuit thought, and how the two shall never come together, or historically shall never come together. And I still remember him doing this in class, and he turns around to the class and he says, "So, what's the problem with hunting caribou?" I'm thinking, problem with hunting caribou? Like, he said, "Well, where do you hunt caribou?" Well, the most prolific place to hunt caribou is hunt caribou while they're crossing lakes or rivers, so while they're swimming. And he said, "So what's the problem?" "Oh, it's a land animal acting as if it was a sea animal, or performing as if it was a sea animal." So the whole thing, and if you look at the literature, the whole thing becomes incredibly framed and bounded by all kinds of restrictions and stories and understandings that go around that. Well, that kind of thinking I never encountered before. And Roger not only taught it to me, but he actually used the Inuit material as an example. And so for him, I wrote a paper called Hair, Fog, and Menstrual Blood on Inuit. And that was my first venture into thinking about some of the symbolic issues with Inuit. And dealing with the problem, because of the fog issue, dealing with the problem of boundaries and the creation of these kind of boundaries, and how these boundaries are collapsed and that kind of thing. It was again, it was an undergraduate paper, but it was the beginning of a lot of the thinking that I did since then. And I have to credit Roger with teaching me that stuff. Roger was also great when I a little later on in my career, when I first was doing field work at sort of clarifying the nature of the dynamics between the field worker and the people you're working with. And he was great later on, as I was writing my thesis, giving me some incredible feedback. Roger went on, and I don't know, I haven't talked to him for years, but he went on to do contract work in anthropology. So he did a lot of private contract work, and lived in Ottawa. So, but I kept in contact with him for years, and he was a very profound influence on my thinking. And brought those ideas out. So that was those were the other advantage to being at University of Toronto in those days. Of course, University of Toronto is, let's put it, it's the largest, wealthiest university in Canada, so they can do things that no other university can do. So I heard people like Mary Douglas speak. Edmund Leach came in to speak. Rodney Needham came in to speak. Maurice Godelier came in to speak. And not only did they come in to speak, but we had graduate seminars with them afterwards, and then we'd go down to the pub with them. So you got an opportunity to actually talk to these great anthropologists of the time. I think I can probably be one of the few people to claim that Maurice Godelier poured an entire pitcher of beer over my head in the course of an argument. But it was, as you may guess, a fairly vigorous argument. But it was an opportunity to meet these very senior people in anthropology at the time, who were doing incredibly interesting work, and to actually be able to engage them one-on-one and talk to them. So that was one of the real advantages to being at a place like U of T. I know that we still try to do some of those things, but as I said, U of T was big, it was rich, they could afford to bring people like that in. And it was really, really something to actually sit down and talk with some of these people. So it was an incredibly vibrant, rich, dynamic period, and it was really a terrific education in anthropology. So I complete my undergraduate in 1977. I'm class of 77. And I wanted to go on to graduate school. Now, if you read the rules on graduate school very carefully, it is possible to go directly into a doctoral program. And but you have to have come out with the equivalent of an honors degree in order to go directly into the doctoral program. And so I applied for, and with David's support, I applied for and went directly into the PhD program at U of T. I never did a master's. Well, I have to qualify that slightly. When I went to see Dr. Nagata about my PhD program, Dr. Nagata said, okay, he said, well, you have to do 7 courses. You're going to do 4 courses this year and 3 courses next year. And I said to him, but Dr. Nagata, the regulations say that I only have to do 3 courses as a doctoral student. He said, yes, but you don't have an MA. I said, yes, but Dr. Nagata, you admitted me into a PhD program, therefore I come under the PhD rules, and the fact that I don't have an MA is irrelevant. Well, this led to an appeal, appeal to the Dean of Graduate Studies, and the Dean of Graduate Studies did what deans do, and he ruled that I had to do 5 courses over the 2 years. So it was better. But so I did graduate courses. In the first year, I did graduate courses and comprehensive examinations in anthropology. Then in the second year, I did the remaining couple of courses. Just to throw in that I did a course in that second year with Paul Buisac on semiotics. Now, Paul Buisac, he did wonderful stuff on the circuits. It was just terrific stuff. I'd never encountered semiotics before, and again, this was really helpful in terms of learning to think about some of the more symbolic materials. David always hated it. He always thought it was a total waste of time, but it was interesting doing that work with Paul Buisac. So did the comprehensive exams, and I did a couple more courses in the second year. I can't even remember what I did, to be honest. But that's also the year that I started working on and writing my research proposal to conduct my PhD research. So I wrote my research proposal, or was writing my research proposal, which, like most doctoral research proposals, was kind of a critical review of the literature and then a suggestion on a way forward. And I'd done the draft on it and given it to David. And I went over to see David Turner about the draft. And David, sitting with a piece of paper on his desk, and he looks at me and he hands me the piece of paper, and it's an announcement for the first Inuit Studies Conference in Quebec City in 1978. And he said to me, I think you should go. I thought, oh, great. I get to go to the first Inuit Studies Conference. Fantastic, great. And he said, yeah, and I think you should give a paper. And I said, well, what am I going to give a paper on? I haven't done any research yet. How can I give a paper? He said, I think you should present your research proposal here, the critical analysis of Inuit social organization that you've done in this research proposal. So I said, oh, okay, well, I have to rewrite it into a paper then, and yeah, that's fine. He said, I'll go over it with you to see that it's okay. But so I signed up to go to the first Inuit Studies Conference in Quebec. Now, because there was nobody at U of T working on Inuit at that time, well, there was Ivan Kalmar was working on Inuit linguistics. Okay, and in fact, I had done a lot of coursework with Ivan. I had read, I'd actually started reading Egade's grammar, which is in Latin, and the Inuktitut, Greenlandic. Just what I wanted was Latin grammars. But I had read most of the literature on Inuit linguistics with Ivan. So he was the only person working on Inuit at U of T at the time. So this would be my opportunity, my exposure to meet everybody in Inuit studies at that time. And so I went to the conference. It was in Quebec City. Um, I have very clear memories of the session that I was in. I don't have very clear memory of the rest of the conference. Um, but the session I was in was chaired by Asymmetric. And I can't remember, and to be honest, this is terrible. I don't remember who else gave papers. But I know that Tiger Birch, David Damas, Gene Briggs, Heinrich, all of those people were in the audience, and of course being chaired by Belichi. So I had the chutzpah, and that's the best word for this, I had the chutzpah to stand up in front of all of these guys and basically critique their life's work. As you can imagine, there was something akin to a nuclear explosion took place in the room. And it ended up with Belichi having to take his shoe off and bang it on the table like Khrushchev and say, okay, everybody's got to sit down and be quiet. There was, I think, an hour and a half of questioning on me, not this was as part of the program. I just got raked over the coals, and it was just unbelievable, the experience. Especially, so you have to remember what, I'm 23 at the time. I'm a young graduate student, and it was just horrendous and eye-opening. But it was after that I met Bernard Saladin-Dangleur, because Bernard came up to me, and he was the only one who said to me, "It's very interesting. I think we should publish it." And hey, I'm going to go with the guy who says that to me, right? I didn't publish it for a while, but that was when that's when I met Bernard, and I think he and I realized that we were basically heading down the same road in some ways. So that's the paper that ultimately got published as the Inukas Object in Inuit Studies. If you look at that paper, the first 2/3 of it is basically a critique, a history and critique of the study of social organizations amongst Inuit. I think the argument still stands, actually. I think it's a pretty good argument. Mark Stevenson basically copied it at the beginning of his book on... that's not unfair. He didn't copy it, but he used the same framework. He fleshed it out. He did a better job than I did, to be honest with you. So the first 2/3 is sort of the history of that critique. The last third of the paper, which is sort of looking forward at that point, is very much picking up on David and Paul Wertman's work in Shamattawa, and the kind of history of co-production and co-residence groups in Shamattawa, and proposing that as a model for the Inuit, a way forward for the Inuit. And so that's what was in that paper. Anyways, I went back to Toronto after that, and I went to see David. I went over to David's office to see him, and so David looks at me and says, "Well, how did it go?" And I said, it was just a total nightmare, David. And he laughed. He said, "Yeah." He said, "I already heard about it from Ivan. Ivan Kalmar had already told him." And he picked up a piece of paper on his desk and he signed it and he handed it across to me. He said, "You passed your examination on your research proposal." He took that experience and he said to me, and I think he was right. He was being honest. Nobody else could have examined me on that material better than the people who'd actually written it themselves. Right? There was nobody at U of T who could have examined me on that, and so he just signed my form that I'd completed the examination for the research proposal, and that was that. That was quite an experience. To do that, and it's quite an experience to meet all those people and to get, as hard as it was, to get the feedback from all those people. And it was wonderful also to encounter Bernard and to begin the very long conversation that Bernard and I have had over the years. So that was that piece. The only other little complication was, where was I going to conduct this field research? And I knew that if I wanted to use the kind of method and the kind of approach that David had been teaching us and that we'd been working on, the kind of theories that we'd been working on, I needed a relatively small community where I could actually get to know practically everybody. So looking around at that time, I thought Clyde River would be the perfect place to do it. And partly because Alex Stevenson had also done a doctoral thesis on Clyde River, on social org at Clyde River, which is actually quite an interesting thesis, and it had some interesting material in it. So I thought, well, it would be good because I could kind of build on what Alex Stevenson has done, and Clyde's about the right size, and it would be a good place to go. What I didn't know, but I shortly found out as soon as I tried to apply for research grants, is, of course, George Wenzel was working there. And there was no way that any research agency was going to fund two people to work on Clyde River. You have to remember, this is very early on in George's career, too. So, he was already working there. And so I had to kind of quickly rethink that. And the next community I encountered was Arctic Bay. The interesting thing about Arctic Bay is that nobody had ever done any research there. Freudchen had passed through there in 1921, 1922. Hugh Brody had done some of his work there, some of the work that lies behind people's land. And Hugh had also done at that time, of course, they were doing the Nunavut Land Use and Occupancy Project. And so Hugh had also done the piece in Arctic Bay up for the Land Use and Occupancy Project. So Hugh had done some work there. But nobody had ever done any substantial ethnographic work in Arctic Bay. I knew that it was related to both the Gluluk, where of course tons of work has been done, a huge ethnographic literature on a Gluluk. And it was also related to Pond Inlet, where although there was less work in Pond Inlet, there was still a fairly substantial ethnographic and historical base in Pond Inlet. So I knew that they were all related, and so there would be material to work with in relationship to Arctic Bay. So I decided to go to Arctic Bay, and I wrote to the Hamlet Council of Arctic Bay asking permission to conduct research. Even in those days, you had to have research licenses and you had to have permissions from the community. So I wrote, and I never heard back from them. Never heard a word. So I'm thinking, oh, okay, what am I going to do? How do I handle this? So I thought, well, all right, the only thing you can do is go to Arctic Bay and actually ask them. So in February, and I would never recommend you go to Arctic Bay in February, not for your first experience anyways. In February of 1979, during Reading Week, I flew up to Arctic Bay. Well, in those days, of course, you flew to Nanisivik because the mine was operating in Nanisivik. It was still called Strathcona Sound at that point. You flew to Nanisivik, and so I arrived by the way, and I spent basically all the money I had on this little jaunt to Arctic Bay. So I arrived in Nanisivik, and I had no idea how you get from the airport in Nanisivik to Arctic Bay. And so I go up to the first Inuit guy that I see, pray to God that he speaks English, and I say, how do I get from here to Arctic Bay? And he said, you come with me, I'm the taxi driver. And it was a guy called Tommy Tatatoapik. And so I just lucked into having to talk to the taxi driver, first of all. So we're riding, and of course, this is February, so the sun is barely up at that time of the year. So we're driving from Arctic Bay, or from Nanisivik to Arctic Bay, or from the airport, actually, because the airport's not in Nanisivik. It was just this total lunar landscape. It was the most alien experience I've ever had. The road from Nanisivik to Arctic Bay is a bit of a dodge, if I can put it that way. There's one point where you put on the brakes and just slide down the hill and hope to God that you can get it to swing around the corner at the bottom before you go into the snowbank on the side. So we're driving to Arctic Bay, and Tommy says to me, "Well, where are you going to stay?" Well, I didn't have anywhere to stay. And I couldn't afford the hotel. The hotel, even in those days, was $200 a night. I'm not even sure of the extent to which the hotel ran, but I said I don't have a place to stay. I've got to find a place to stay. And Tommy just said, "Well, fine, come and stay with me." So all right. I went and stayed with Tommy and his family, his wife Puyuk and his kids. Um, that was actually my first experience of how to operate in the North. I was terrified, absolutely terrified. Next day, I walked down to the Hamlet Council and I explained who I was and that I'd written them this letter, and this is of course a very typical reply. They looked at me and they said, "Oh yeah, we got your letter, but we didn't know what to do with that. I mean, what were we supposed to do with this? You know, so no, it's just here, it's sitting right here." And yeah, thanks guys. So what I did is I talked to the various members of Hamlet Council, um, uh, well, with interpreters. Uh, I was advised by one of the white folks in town that if I planned to do anything in Arctic Bay, that the person I had to get on board was a guy called Philip Kamenik, and that I better go over and see Kamenik. So I went over to see Kamenik, and it was a relatively positive encounter, and Kamenik didn't seem to object. So that was okay. And so basically the answer I got was, well, yeah, come back in June, and yeah, then we'll have a Hamlet Council meeting and decide whether you can do your research. So I thought, okay, well, that's fine. That's as best as I'm going to get out of this. So I made the, I went back to Toronto and then proceeded to make the arrangements to go up to conduct my my work there. But it was kind of a, if I can say, a kind of shotgun way to start your research. I wouldn't. I don't know that I'd ever recommend to anybody that you get on a plane, you fly into the Arctic in February and with no place to stay and nowhere to go and drop in to see people and get their agreement to do research there. But that was in fact, well, that's how I did it. And at that point, I didn't speak Inuktitut. It was very difficult in those days to get lessons to speak Inuktitut before you went into the North. So I had worked through virtually all of the grammars and all of the material, all of the articles with Ivan Kalmar. Which meant that I had a fairly extensive knowledge of the grammar, but I couldn't put a sentence together. I had virtually no vocabulary. The one thing that was helpful, though, in that, and in the long run, was I always figured that if the linguists couldn't work out how something worked in Inuktitut, then I wasn't about to work out how it was going to work in Inuktitut, and just to learn how to do it and say it and not worry about the grammatical structure. Where the linguists had worked it out, that was fine. I could learn that. But there were plenty of pieces of Inuktitut which continued to be much fought over in the linguistic world, which I've decided, not my problem. I don't have to solve it. But I do have to be able to use those structures. So at that point, flying up to Arctic Bay in February, I spoke virtually no Inuktitut, and I had a good grasp on the grammar, but I didn't speak any of the language. So that was sort of my preparation to go to Arctic Bay, and that's where we are.